Good afternoon. I'm David Nuremberg, and I think for the first time in my life, I get to say that I'm the director and the Leon Levy Professor at the, at the Institute for Advanced Studies. I'm pleased to welcome you today to today's public policy lecture. It's part of a series curated by the School of Social Sciences that seeks to examine current issues in politics, science, the economy, and society. I'd like to thank the Public Policy Selection Committee for making this lecture possible. And since this does happen to be my first event as director, I feel it particularly auspicious that I'm welcoming Keeanga-Yamhatta Taylor, professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, a scholar and activist in the truest sense of both words, who is doing so much to illuminate the history of the Black American experience, of social movements, and of racial inequality in the United States. Government policy towards land and real estate markets has been one very important thread in that history, encompassing practices from segregation and covenant restrictions to mortgage programs. Her talk today focuses on the predatory housing policies and practices that undermined Black homeowners in the 1970s, studied in her recent book, Race for Profit, which you can find outside. I was strictly enjoined not to speak for more than 3 minutes, which leaves me with far too little time to introduce appropriately our introducer, Wendy Brown, the UPS Foundation Professor in the School of Social Science. Fortunately, all of you already know Professor Brown's work, for she is one of the most preeminent political theorists of her generation. She is the author, co-author of a dozen books in English. Her work has been translated into more than 20 languages. And beginning with her earliest work on manhood and politics, a work that is perhaps even more relevant today than when it was written, she has showed an uncanny ability to foresee the most foundational problems and urgent needs confronting our polities. In 1995, her States of Injury, Power and Freedom in Late Modernity interrogated identity politics and state power. Her critical analysis of tolerance in regulating aversion, tolerance in the age of identity and empire in 2006, her account of the interregnum between nation state and globalization and walled states waning sovereignty. Each of these titles, apart from being beautiful, is prophetic. And her study of neoliberalism's assault on democratic principles, institutions, and citizenship in Undoing the Demos and in The Ruins of Neoliberalism. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over Professor Brown's appointments, distinguished fellowships, visiting professorships, et cetera, and simply conclude by stating the obvious, which is what directors mostly do. I could introduce no better interlocutor for what I know will be a discussion of the highest critical significance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brown.
Welcome. It's a great honor, and we are very fortunate to be able to welcome Professor Keeanga-Yamhatta Taylor to the Institute for Advanced Study to offer the public policy lecture. Professor Taylor's titles and prizes are many, especially for one who obtained her PhD less than a decade ago. She is Professor of African American Studies at Princeton. She is a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow, and of course last year was also awarded the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship. She has been a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, and she was in the inaugural cohort of Freedom Scholars. The Root named her in 2016 as among the 100 most influential African Americans in the US. This was followed by Essence Magazine in 2018, naming her as among the top change makers in the country. She's edited or authored 3 books: How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective. This book won the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ nonfiction in 2018. Then From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, which won the Lannan Cultural Freedom Award for an especially notable book in 2016. And Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership, which was a 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer in history. Word on the street is that she is also a dedicated, effective, and inspiring teacher. Now, if you are already wondering when or whether she sleeps, add this. Professor Taylor is a frequent guest on venues like NPR, Democracy Now!, a variety of podcasts. She's written pieces for the New York Times, LA Times, The Guardian, Boston Review, Jacobin, Dissent. She's a regular contributing writer to The New Yorker, where, as some of you know, she keeps pace with issues of the day, from attacks on abortion rights to attacks on teaching America's racial histories in schools. From reflecting on the long tail of Black Lives Matter protests to reflecting on centrists now blaming the left for the flailing and failing of the Democratic Party. Accomplished, anointed, published, public, Professor Taylor's contributions exceed this constellation of achievements and honors. She spent her formative years, it seems, as a tenant advocate, and she is one of those rare human beings who did not let her path through higher education and rapidly up its ladder drain a single drop from the political urgency or radicalism that was honed in those beginnings. Commitment to affordable, amenable housing deserved by every human being on the planet, but especially those denied it along the color line, animates her scholarship, her public writing, and her involvement with left campaigns against eviction and homelessness. In her research, she excavates and analyzes every relevant historical vein to discover how homeownership for African Americans has been systematically undermined by the state, the real estate industry, and what she brilliantly theorizes as predatory inclusion by the banks, the latter resulting in 250,000 African Americans losing their homes to foreclosure after the 2008 finance capital meltdown. Taylor connects the dots across a century of redlining, ill-conceived public housing, sales of uninhabitable homes to poor Blacks, subsidization of white suburbs, public-private partnerships, and the continued containment of large Black populations to decaying neighborhoods for which they are in turn blamed, pathologized. Her work makes clear that the political clout of the voracious real estate industry is to decent national housing policy what the political clout of the pharmaceutical industry is to a decent national health program. Her work also makes clear that given the relationship of housing to accessing good schools, jobs, and futures, no issue cuts more deeply, more directly into the rising racialized wealth and opportunity gaps of our time. Indeed, in the California Bay Area that is my more permanent home, a scandalous speculative real estate market has driven thousands of poor and working people from the area in the last decade, some into grotesque commutes that foul their own health and that of the planet, others into homelessness. The Bay Area, with its small total population, has the third highest total population of homeless people in the country. 40% of the Bay Area homeless population is Black, and in Oakland, that figure rises to almost 75%. Notwithstanding depictions in the mainstream press, many of the unhoused are substance-free, employed, and have kids in school. There are more than 3,000 homeless kids in the San Francisco public schools. But as all housing has become a speculative asset for banks, investors, and realtors, and for which whiteness always raises the value, even a full-time job can't put a roof over a Black worker's head, let alone lead to owning that roof. No one explains better, more deeply, in more precise historical and theoretical terms, why this is so than Keeanga-Yamhatta Taylor. Race for Profit, How Banks and Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership is the title of her talk today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thank you for that very warm introduction. Thank you to Alondra Nelson for reaching out and inviting me to come And thank you for the Institute for hosting. Even though I'm over at Princeton, I have never been here before, so I'm very grateful for the opportunity. So I'm going to talk about my book, Race for Profit, and hopefully we can have a productive conversation afterwards. In July of 2019, in what was typical of the racist vitriol spewed by Donald Trump, he described the city of Baltimore as the quote, worst run and most dangerous city anywhere. In a rant directed against the late Elijah Cummings, an African-American congressman who represented that city, Trump continued, quote, Cummings district is a disgusting rat and rodent infested mess that no human being would want to live in. If Cummings spent more time in Baltimore, maybe he could help clean up this very dangerous and filthy place. Of course, many human beings live and continue to live in Baltimore, and most of them are Black. Despite Trump's rhetoric, rat infestation in Black, poor, and working class communities is not evidence of African-American indifference to the conditions in their neighborhoods. Instead, rats have always been markers of substandard housing that thrives in the enclosure of residential segregation. The menace of rats in Black working class neighborhoods in the 1960s also inspired ridicule from mean-spirited and racist white conservatives. And it also sparked activism and even uprisings. In August 1967, nearly 2 weeks after riots in Detroit prompted the rare deployment of federal troops into an American city, dozens of demonstrators burst into the chambers of the House of Representatives chanting, "We rats cause riots." Days earlier, Congress had rejected a 2-year, $40 million bill to exterminate rats in inner cities across the United States. The protesters sat in the gallery of the hall for 20 minutes, repeating the slogan, "We want a rat bill now," at even higher volumes. The previous attempt at passing the bill had not merely been voted down, but had been ridiculed in the process. A Virginia Republican mocked the legislation to howls of laughter from other white representatives saying, quote, "Mr. Speaker, I think the rat smart thing for us to do is to vote down this rat bill right now." One of his colleagues mocked it as another, quote, "civil rats bill." No laughing matter for the people who lived in the inner city. Rats were the most visceral example of the unequal living conditions forced onto Black people in mid-century America. In the 1960s, African-American media regularly reported on rat attacks on the most vulnerable members of Black urban households, children. Lorraine McTush, a single Black mother, complained to a Chicago Defender reporter in 1967 that she stayed up most nights because of rats. The rats crawling in her bed, which made her nervous, and the rats in her children's bed, which terrified her. She said, "They get into the bunk beds, and so I sit up all night. I am miserable and afraid." 2 days before his birthday in 1966, Andre Adams was, quote, "chewed to death" by a rat while sleeping in his crib, a death so shocking that more than 1,000 African Americans gathered on Chicago's West Side to protest. One activist recalled the prior summer's deadly riot, shouting, "Remember Watts." A newspaper report described the child's death. Quote, "When he lay in the crib, you could see the holes where the rats had chewed. The little finger on his right hand was tied on with a string." Chicago health officials disagreed, claiming that the child died of malnutrition, but nevertheless conceded that the rats had fed on the dead baby's body. Civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke at a hastily organized protest, reminded the crowd, "This is why we are fighting against slums in Chicago." Noting the similarities between racism in the South and the urban ghettos in the North, King declared, quote, "This is as much of a civil rights tragedy as the murder of Ms. Viola Liuzzo, a white housewife who had been killed by Klansmen after she marched in Selma the previous spring. The rat infestation in Black neighborhoods was profound. When African American children in a Chicago neighborhood were given a vocabulary test and asked to identify various familiar objects, more than 60% of the children misidentified a rat as a teddy bear. A report produced about the causes of riots in Philadelphia in the summer of 1964 found that in the riot area, more than half of the housing in that neighborhood, those neighborhoods had been determined by the city to be substandard. The report found that many, quote, many of those houses have rat-infested pools in their basement, rotted and missing floorboards, and exposed wiring. The report also found that children living in Negro slums experienced 80% of lead poisoning deaths and 100% of reported rat bites. These were the evidence of exclusion and enclosure, and they boiled over into the electricity of successive waves of uprisings across the country. A Harris poll taken in the summer of 1965 after riots in South Central Los Angeles found housing conditions listed among the top 3 concerns of all Americans. In the weeks after the uprising in Detroit in 1967, a Washington Post poll forcefully linked deteriorating conditions in Black communities with the uprisings. Fully 70% of Black people attributed rioting to housing conditions. 59% of Blacks said they knew someone living in rat-infested housing. 57% reported holes in their ceilings. 49% said their housing was overcrowded. And 68% reported cockroaches in their homes. In the poll, even 39% of white people said they believed the conditions of Black housing was responsible for ongoing rioting. By the end of the 1960s, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, had left no doubt that substandard housing, evidenced by rat infestation, was a recurring factor in the annual bouts of riots that roiled American cities throughout the decade. Identifying segregation at the root of these conditions and as a significant source of rage in Black communities, the Commission's findings called for historic changes to American housing policies. A landmark Supreme Court case, Jones versus Mayer, decided just weeks after the passage of the Fair Housing Act in the spring of 1968, drew upon the 1866 Civil Rights Act and invoked the 13th Amendment in describing housing segregation as a badge of slavery. The decision said, quote, in part, when racial discrimination herds men into ghettos and makes their ability to buy property turn on the color of their skin, then it is a relic of slavery. The final piece of the battle to open the US housing market to African Americans came with the Housing and Urban Development Act in August of 1968. The 1968 HUD Act was Lyndon Johnson's last greatest legislative achievement. It was a bill planned in collaboration with representatives from private enterprise and what was known as the Kaiser Commission. The businessmen who participated described their promotion of single-family homeownership for poor people as, quote, socio-commercial enterprise, business with a conscience. Johnson described the legislation as the Magna Carta for the cities, and its focus on the market and ownership ensured that it was a bipartisan bill. Where the Fair Housing Act in 1968 declared an end to racial discrimination in the buying, selling, renting, or financing of housing, the HUD Act was poised to create a bounty of new housing that would ease the urban housing crisis at the root of the Black insurgency. For decades, federal officials had relied on public housing to shelter poor and low-income people. But by the end of the 1960s, public housing had become politically untenable, with endless jousts over its maintenance, location, and eligibility for tenancy. Housing for the poor suffered from a mixture of government neglect and shrinking tenancy because the conditions were so poor that anyone who could leave did leave, making public housing the housing of last resort, available only to the poorest tenants by the end of the 1960s. The HUD Act was a pivot away from the notion of public or state responsibility for housing the poor or low income. At the heart of the legislation was a low-income homeownership plan that aimed to transform low-income renters into low-income homeowners. Federal officials turned to homeownership as a cheaper program compared to the big investments in federal public housing programs. With the HUD Act, the cost of the houses was absorbed mostly by the individuals who qualified for the housing subsidy. This meant that the federal government could make payments over time as opposed to the upfront expenses necessary to develop, build, and manage public housing. These economic concerns also fit with the growing idea that homeownership could stabilize the anger and restiveness coursing through American cities. Freshman Senator Charles Percy, a Republican from Illinois, described the benefits of expanding homeownership as, quote, a new dawn of opportunity on which a new national effort to bring dignity and a better life to today's slum dwellers must be based. We can democratize our cities. We can give people of the ghetto a piece of the action, let them be somebody and achieve something. President Richard Nixon also said of the bill, people, quote, people who own their own homes don't burn their neighborhoods. Rather, in pride and self-interest, they turn to fixing up their communities and making them livable for themselves and their neighbors. The terms of the new homeownership program created by the HUD Act were a low $200 down payment, 20% of a participant's income as their mortgage, regardless of the cost of the house, and interest rates that were capped at 1%. The homes would also be covered by mortgage insurance provided through the Federal Housing Administration. The inclusion of federal mortgage insurance for the first time meant that in the worst case scenario, foreclosure or abandonment, the federal government was obligated to pay back the mortgage to the lenders. These terms kept the prices of the homes low and manageable for low-income and working-class people. FHA mortgage insurance is what allowed the housing boom after World War II, when banks were enticed to begin lending on a massive scale after having pulled back from lending during the Depression. The creation of FHA mortgage insurance underwrote the housing boom that created the white middle class. The assumption was that it could do the same for working-class Black families, families that had been excluded from the original program. The inclusion of FHA mortgage insurance also had another effect. It removed almost all of the risk from the real estate industry. As one official described the program, quote, "It's like doing business in heaven. You can't lose money." The unprecedented program linked federal agencies to real estate brokers and mortgage bankers to supply the loans, the housing loans to people in neighborhoods these organizations had previously excluded or redlined. But with the promise of lucrative subsidies and guarantees of mortgage insurance and the promise of profit that came with them, the historic hostility of these private sector forces melted away. But these same conditions also opened new pathways for corrupt real estate practices. Speculators and brokers bought up cheap, dilapidated properties, hoping to flip them for higher prices and sales to people who would qualify for these new programs. The entirety of the program was in the hands of real estate operatives. HUD sent brokers lists of eligible properties. When real estate brokers matched a person with a house, they connected the prospective buyer with a mortgage lender. The mortgage lender consulted with HUD to determine if the person qualified for the program. But at no time did the individual speak with a representative of the federal government. Not only could money be made by flipping cheap properties, but brokers found it easy to bribe poorly paid FHA appraisers to inflate the value of the houses in the new urban market. Bankers made money on the front end of the real estate deal by securing the loan, and then they made money on the back end with expensive closing costs associated with selling the property. Everyone made money, except the poor Black families that were disproportionately saddled with these broken homes in cities across the country. One homeowner turned activist described the collusion this way, quote, "The outright murder of our neighborhoods in America is aided and abetted by the Federal Housing Administration, the mortgage industry, the insurance industry, and the unscrupulous real estate industry. These four institutions are working together to systematically destroy what's left of America's cities. What for so long has been considered a natural phenomenon, changing neighborhoods, deteriorating cities, is not natural. It is an outright plan, and the government, the realtors, and the big money people are making lots of money changing neighborhoods out of the communities that we call home." The federal government's turn to homeownership was a consummate expression of post-war racial liberalism that viewed inclusion into American democracy through the vehicles of citizenship, law, and free market capitalism as the key to unlocking equality and social mobility for Black citizens, as it had been for white Americans through the New Deal and the GI Bill after World War II. But in narrowing their focus to access alone, racial liberals overlooked the racist practices embedded within those institutions. This was shockingly clear in the real estate industry. Banks and real estate had played a central role in creating the urban housing crisis. So their sudden involvement, the sudden involvement of these same private sector forces, was a recipe for disaster. This obviously did not mean that African Americans should continue to be excluded. Rather, it demanded greater scrutiny, greater enforcement of rules regarding the protection of civil rights, and specific plans to undo the practices that had resulted in Black exclusion in the first place. Without that level of scrutiny and the threat of behavior-altering punishment, there was nothing in place to prevent the continuation of those practices. Instead of scrutiny and regulation, though, predatory practices continued. The racist exclusion of African Americans gave way to their predatory inclusion. I use predatory inclusion to describe the different, more expensive, and ultimately exploitative terms upon which African Americans were admitted into the world of conventional real estate under the guise of colorblind neutrality. In reality, decades of color-conscious exclusion had created poverty, dilapidation, and deterioration in working-class and poor Black communities. Those conditions of exclusion and deprivation were then perniciously wielded as evidence that Black neighborhoods were risks to property values and loan repayment. More generally, predatory inclusion described how Black people were welcomed into institutions and practices from which they had formerly been excluded through the use of new methods by which they could continue to be extracted from or financially exploited, but now without attribution to race or ethnicity. Notions of risk replaced mention of race as the guiding explanations for why Black buyers could be treated differently within the marketplace. Those risk factors were informed by job status, credit history, neighborhood condition, zip code, debt accumulation, and other supposed race-neutral factors used to create translucent consumer composites. But there is no such thing as race neutrality in the American political economy. Instead, these factors simply allowed banks and the real estate industry to circumvent new civil rights restrictions that banned outright and explicit racism while obliquely creating new means of extraction and exploitation of marginalized Black buyers. Predatory inclusion meant that African Americans paid more for substandard or distressed properties while receiving worse, if any, return on their investment. In the supposed colorblind, race-neutral American marketplace, Black investment in the housing market could result in credit-shattering, insurmountable debt with no hopes of their homes gaining value over time. This, of course, did not mean that homes of Black people had no value. Black housing, even in its greatest distress, could be fortresses of refuge, places of communion, sites of connection, but rarely was it the financial asset that it had been for millions of white Americans. It was this issue of value that so much of the housing market turned on. The key to the American dream of homeownership was not just simple possession of property, but just as important was whether the value of that property would rise over time, increasing the owner's equity. In a society with an anemic social welfare state, the boost in home values were determinative of one's quality of life. The ascending value of a home could help finance a college education, an unforeseen financial or health crisis, or contribute to a comfortable retirement. But homes did not ascend or descend in value on their own terms. The surrounding neighborhood and the value or lack of value of other buildings, businesses, and institutions helped determine whether a neighborhood was good or bad. In the United States, value was also shaped by whether a property owner was white or Black, surrounded by other white people or surrounded by Black people. There is a perception in our society that value is intrinsic, tangible, real. We know what has value when we see it, just as clearly as we understand the lack of value when we see it. But in this way, value within the housing market is socially constructed, a strange alchemy of race, place, and the perceptions of the buying public. In 1932, Frederick M. Babcock wrote in his seminal book, The Appraisal of Real Estate, quote, "It is obvious that there is no absolute ironclad method of computing real estate values, because values are a social phenomenon dependent upon human behavior. The intensely subjective process of determining the value of property or a neighborhood, or the pseudoscience of real estate appraisal, was inherently informed by the presence or absence of African Americans. The American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers said as much when its professional manual maintained, quote, "The clash of nationalities with dissimilar cultures contribute to the destruction of value. When a new class of people of different race, color, nationality, and culture moves into a neighborhood, old inhabitants think that the neighborhood is losing desirability." Thus, the intensity of anti-Black racism in American society was inevitably wound into these notions of property value, neighborhood, and community value. The assumptions that Black people were harmful to property values drove the desire to keep them segregated. It justified their marginalization in the housing market. It offered a, quote, "common sense explanation for the disproportionate conditions of dilapidation, distress, and substandard housing largely owned by whites and rented to Black people." In 1940, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in an essay for his book, Dusk of Dawn, quote, "I think it was in Africa that I came more clearly to see the close connection between race and wealth. The fact that even in the minds of the most dogmatic supporters of race theories and believers in the inferiority of colored folk to white, there was a conscious or unconscious determination to increase their incomes by taking full advantage of this belief. And then gradually this thought was metamorphosized into a realization that the income-bearing value of race prejudice was the cause and not the result of theories of race inferiority. The difference in value for homes belonging to white families compared to homes owned by Black families produced a tension between exchange value and use value in housing, or more intimately, the difference between real estate and a home. These contradictory objectives of real estate and home, one a commodity and the other intimating a place of belonging, also reinforced reactionary racial norms and deepened the perception of dual housing markets working at dual purposes. Mid-century narratives of normative whiteness embodied in conceptions of the suburban-based nuclear family shaped perceptions of home as an expression of use value within white communities. Conversely, developing narratives concerning perceived domestic dysfunction within Black living spaces, whether non-normative family formation or poverty or dilapidated living structures, cast Black dwellings as incapable of achieving the status of home, thus reducing them to their base exchange value. Where white housing was seen as an asset developed through inclusion and the accruable possibilities of its surrounding property, Black housing was marked by its exclusion and isolation, where value was extracted, not imbued. These racialized narratives of families, communities, and their built environments reinforced and naturalized the segregative practices among real estate brokers, mortgage bankers, and the white public. Indeed, these perceptions of insurmountable difference, steeped in the permanence of blood, race, and culture, constituted the underwriting criteria that determined who was to be excluded and who should be included. In this way, segregation was profitable. Value accrued to white housing the further it was from African Americans and their neighborhoods. But value could also be found in segregated and distressed housing for African Americans. Only the value did not flow to Black homeowners. Black families were vessels through which capital flowed from enclosed Black neighborhoods back out to banks and real estate operatives. Bankers and agents of real estate confined each group to its own section of a single housing market to preserve the allure of exclusivity for whites, while satisfying the demand of housing for both Black and white. This was evidence not of a dual housing market, but of a single American housing market that conflated race and risk, linking both to the rise and fall of property values and generating profits that grew into the sinews that bound it all together. A white housing market would have been unintelligible without its Black counterpart. Both relied on the other to make each legible. This reality exposed the thinness of racial liberalism, where inclusion was the bromide offered as a palliative to the rigid structures of white supremacy that held together the market, the state, and the law itself. The collusive relationship between the public and private sectors in the production of public policy and housing policies undermined the potential for inclusion to make meaning of African American citizenship. Consider the experiences of Janice Johnson. On September 18, 1970, Janice Johnson bought her first home in Philadelphia with a mortgage guaranteed by the Federal Housing Administration. By all previous standards, Johnson was an atypical buyer. She was a Black single mother on welfare and living with her 8-year-old son in a decaying apartment in a building that had recently been condemned by city officials. Now facing eviction, Johnson needed to quickly find a new place to live when her mother told her of an apartment for rent in the same neighborhood. Johnson called the landlord in anticipation, but her hopes were dashed when he told her that he couldn't rent her the apartment because she was a welfare recipient. The landlord, however, quickly pivoted from offering a rental to suggesting that Janice Johnson buy a house in the same neighborhood. As a welfare recipient, Johnson qualified for one of HUD's new low-income homeownership programs and was ultimately able to purchase a house with an FHA-backed loan for $5,600. Within weeks, though, Janice Johnson realized that her home was not the fulfillment of the American dream. It was the beginning of an American nightmare. Days after moving into her house, the sewer line broke, spewing wastewater all over the basement floor. The electricity for the house was sporadic and haphazard. There were holes and other irregularities in the foundation of the house. The compromised structure of the house was not the worst of it. On Halloween night, Johnson's son, Edward, woke up to find a rat in his bed. Janice Johnson saw rats throughout her house, including in the kitchen and bathroom. Apparently, the holes in the basement harbored nests of rats that regularly entered her home. She called the agent who sold her the house to complain of its condition. He sent workmen out on a couple of occasions, and they even patched the falling plaster in her dining room. But soon after, the real estate agent reminded Janice Johnson that the problems in her house were now her own. They were what he called homeowner's business. Miserable and dangerous housing conditions in the existing urban market led people to walk away from their homes that had recently been purchased, and the number of defaults and foreclosures and FHA insurance payments began to rise. By the end of 1973, tens of thousands of homes paid for by the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs were in foreclosure. By May of 1974, HUD was in possession of 78,000 single-family homes that had been foreclosed upon. Congressional investigations into impropriety in the homeownership programs showed that federal appraisers had been taking bribes and inflating the value of dilapidated homes by 3 or 4 times their actual value. Local mortgage bankers were also accused of accepting bribes to ignore inconsistencies in paperwork needed to authorize the purchase and sale of particular houses. Newspaper reports and hundreds of federal indictments identified local FHA officials, appraisers, real estate agents, and mortgage lenders as all involved in the swindle. These were not only scandals, but crimes that had been committed against poor and working class Black and Latinos. In cities as diverse as Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Jose, and Columbia, South Carolina, real estate brokers, FHA officials, and mortgage bankers were arrested and indicted for a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. In 1974, 28 HUD officials were indicted for their role in the housing scandal, along with other mortgage brokers and real estate agents. The FBI also had another 1,900 active investigations open for fraud. The public crisis in the homeownership programs coincided with an end to the long post-war economic boom that had been the foundation of the American dream. Instead, by the end of 1973, unemployment was on the rise, as was inflation, creating the economic conundrum of stagflation. The onset of recession, the deepest since the 1930s, created a political opportunity to roll these programs back by stoking the racial resentment of white suburbanites and the perception that these programs were for undeserving African Americans. This opportunity helped to shape the political climate that allowed the Nixon administration to implement their long-held plan to shift power back to the states when it came to the distribution of social welfare. The overriding objective was to unravel the Johnson welfare state and replace it with revenue sharing, block grants, and a devolved role of the federal government, while promoting an agenda of local control of the distribution of social welfare funds for cities and states. While there had been bipartisan support for low-income homeownership, the mounting scandals were becoming a political problem. Advocates and other elected officials argued that there should be less emphasis on used or existing housing and more of a focus on building new homes in cities to give Black people more, better, and cheaper housing options. This was certainly not in Nixon's plans, not after he had carefully cultivated the white silent majority coalition made up of disaffected white suburbanites who fought to keep their communities exclusively white. The growing spectacle of scandal and mounting foreclosures within the HUD homeownership programs generated the momentum for the right to attack these housing policies. The political attacks were, of course, not confined to housing, but the entire social welfare state came into question. These programs that had been won largely in part to the insurgent Black social movement that had helped to redefine Black poverty and inequality as product of government policy and American capitalism. From the March on Washington's insistence on freedom and jobs, to Malcolm X's insistence that there could be no capitalism without racism, to Stokely Carmichael's coinage of the phrase institutional racism, and to the Black Panther Party's anti-capitalist, anti-colonial framing, the movement had clearly defined the structural foundations of Black inequality, and more importantly, the need for public programs and a redistribution of wealth and resources to address it. Thus, to effectively undermine these programs, the right attacked the participants as undeserving, ungrateful, and ultimately untrustworthy. For the HUD homeownership program, this meant demonizing the poorest of the program participants as undeserving. The effort to encourage low-income homeownership among African Americans was castigated as bizarre and a naive exercise in social engineering. As an Ohio Congressman, Thomas Ashley, put it, you cannot run a middle-class program in a ghetto. Members of Congress and news reporters turned their attention to the poorest participants in the programs, Black women on welfare who had been aggressively targeted to become homeowners. These women, many of whom had been recruited from deteriorating public housing complexes, were particularly susceptible to buying homes that were in poor condition because they were desperate for housing for themselves and their children. But when questions surfaced about the condition of their housing as an act of self-preservation, HUD investigators linked the distressed housing of the women to their homemaking skills. In one hearing, HUD Secretary George Romney, the former governor of Michigan, claimed, quote, "I think it's a sad fact that this condition exists, but it does exist. And we do have fatherless families and homes where the woman has no idea what to do under those circumstances. As a matter of fact, many of them have moved out of public housing units where all of those things are taken care of for them, so they don't know the cost of utilities. We have had instances where they have a leaky toilet and didn't think it meant anything, and at the end of the month, they get a $50 or $60 bill for water, and they're shocked. We have had a long time of encouraging people to think that they are going to get something for nothing in this country, and consequently, it is beginning to affect a lot of the problems that we have." A congressman responded to Romney by saying, quote, "I think we have inequities in public housing, but I do think we have to take an honest and realistic look at them. People come from the rural South, and they come up here and they're housed in public housing. They were never counseled on housekeeping or budget management. You can't just take people and throw them on the street. It is management that we are concerned about in public housing. They're weak." Some officials were even more explicit in their attacks. Georgia Congressman Ben Blackburn said, "The problem is that we have been putting families into homes who have no sense of responsibility when it comes to home ownership. And there is a problem, and where the problem has been is that it is intrinsic to the program. We found welfare mothers whose sole income was aid for dependent children, plus other benefits that come from this status in life. And they were put in housing, presumably as owners, and yet they could not even fix a faucet." Of course, there was the undeniable irony of rich white men of Congress who relied upon Black women as maids and caretakers for their families, now complaining about Black women's homemaking skills. But there was a larger issue, focusing on African American women's housekeeping abilities, deflected from the more pressing question of why the FHA was insuring properties in uninhabitable condition. After all, an earlier audit of HUD's homeownership programs concluded, quote, "No homeowner can be expected to cope with poor construction, cracked foundations, improper wiring, and a general failure of contractors to meet local building and maintenance requirements." It is important to say that Black women were not just victims of this kind of abuse, and it was their willingness to seek out help and use the resources created by legal aid to engage in litigation that the criminal aspects of these programs came to light in the first place. By the mid-1970s, especially in Philadelphia, Black women were at the helm of important grassroots organizing efforts to make HUD and FHA fulfill the promises of to repair the broken houses that had been sold to them on the watch of those organizations. But Nixon officials were able to use the spectacular fraud and corruption of HUD's homeownership program as evidence that the government should get out of the business of housing poor and low-income people. The highly visible collapse of the low-income homeownership program not only raised questions about the role of the state in housing people, but it also allowed officials to gain support for keeping poor and working-class Black people out of white suburban communities. In January 1973, in his last act as HUD secretary, George Romney announced a national moratorium on the construction or funding of all federally subsidized housing programs, including all of the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. Months later, Nixon would tell Congress, quote, "All across America, the federal government has become the biggest slumlord in history. Leaders of all political persuasions and from all levels of government agree that the federally subsidized housing approach has failed." Instead, he suggested, of the policy alternatives available, the most promising way to achieve decent housing for all of our families at an acceptable cost appears to be direct cash assistance. This was the beginning of the federal turn to Section 8 housing vouchers, first issued in 1974. The introduction of vouchers was coupled with a demand from the Nixon administration that existing housing or used housing be utilized for low-income housing, while new construction of low-income housing was to be scaled back. Existing housing was understood to be in cities, further cementing the racial division in low-income housing. The Nixon administration secured $3 billion for the construction of new low-income homes that were going to be built in the suburbs. New construction was all but guaranteed to be built in suburbs largely reserved for white residents. The existing housing in the cities for Black renters and new construction in suburbs for white buyers, Nixon's segregated vision for housing in the United States was fulfilled. In closing, when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, he called for HUD to convene a special commission on housing policy in 1982. For more than 30 years, after pledging to provide decent homes for its citizens, the federal government and its Department of Housing continued to fail to achieve its goal. The latest Housing Commission, paneled by Reagan, called its report "To House a Nation," and it began with a criticism of the 1968 HUD Act. The HUD Act had left as its legacy, quote, "a belief in the potency of government programs." Reagan's Commission on Housing promised the opposite, quote, "The genius of the market economy, freed from the distortions forced by government housing policies and regulations that swung erratically from loving to hostile, can provide for housing far better than federal programs." It was a conclusion that could only be reached by ignoring the actual origins of the HUD Act and the reasons behind its demise. Lyndon Johnson had also promised the, quote, "genius of private industry" as the key to unlocking the mystery of perpetual housing crises. But lackadaisical management, erratic regulations, and trenchant racial discrimination, combined with the end of redlining and predacious inclusion of formerly excluded Black urbanites, allowed the real estate industry to bleed cities dry. It was not government intrusion that sank the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership program. It was government negligence. But this malfeasance was not just an issue of poorly motivated personnel. It was the outcome of mismatched objectives and impossible tasks. When public policies are guided by the objectives of private enterprise, as the HUD homeownership programs undoubtedly were, they are clinched in a dance of conflict. As magnanimous as the life insurance industry and other titans of business who argued for socio-commercial enterprise in the 1960s tried to present themselves, in the end, the objective of profit-making outpaced the necessity for safe and sound housing. One glaring reason for this spoke to the heart of the conflict. Real estate profits were rooted in residential segregation. Race was turned into profit. There is a tendency to view the post-riot city as trapped in the stasis of blight and inevitability of decay over time. But the late 1960s and 70s were defined by changing political, social, and economic dynamics, and the inner city was at the nexus of these processes. New financial instruments, such as mortgage-backed securities, produced an intense demand for more homeowners and more money for home financing, while lax oversight and regulation incentivized unscrupulous and predatory targeting of urban communities. Far from being a static site of dilapidation and ruin, the urban core was becoming an attractive place of unparalleled opportunity, a new frontier of economic investment and extraction for the real estate and banking industries. The race for profit in the 1970s transformed blighted urban space into what one U.S. senator described as a, quote, golden ghetto, where profits for banks and real estate brokers were never ending, and shattered credit and ruined neighborhoods were all that remained for Black people who lived there. These are not just important historical lessons, but they have direct bearing on the communities and neighborhoods we live in today. Housing policies over much of the 20th century, and certainly since the housing crisis of the 1970s, contributed to the uneven development of Black urban and suburban communities compared to white urban and suburban communities. The geographic scars created by the FHA HUD crisis, where nearly 80,000 single-family homes were repossessed, but hundreds of thousands of more multifamily units also went into foreclosure, exacerbated a crisis of abandonment that animated the optics of distress and dilapidation. A generation later, those conditions became the basis for designating a place and the people who lived there as subprime. For more than 50 years, the private sector has been viewed as the most capable of ending the persisting urban housing crisis. And yet those crises have become even starker over time, creating even greater degrees of housing precarity. This is especially true in the realm of homeownership. The acceleration of subprime lending in the atmosphere of deregulation in the late 1990s and 2000s resulted in unprecedented home losses for Black people. The practice of subprime lending was contingent on racial practices and assumptions across the housing industry and among the general public. The cascade of foreclosures and mortgage defaults further eroded the value of property in Black communities, once again hollowing out the notion of homes as assets for African Americans. The net loss of more than 240,000 homes for African Americans in the aftermath of the 2008 housing crisis created the pretext for mortgage lenders to once again use risk in place of race to marginalize potential Black homeowners. The recurring perception of risky Black buyers has opened new pathways or reopened pathways for the reemergence of naked predatory practices in the real estate market. From rent-to-own schemes to the reappearance of predatory land contracts in lieu of conventional mortgages, real estate continues to pilfer African Americans in search of home. It is not history repeating itself. It is the predictable outcome when housing is a commodity and continues to be promoted as the fulfillment and meaning of citizenship. Thank you.
Keeanga, are you content staying right there? Or would you like to sit? Okay.
I'll stand for
Yeah.
a while.
Okay.
I just talked for a really long time.
No, you did not. You talked for a perfect amount of time. It was utterly stimulating and amazingly compressed as an analysis. So we welcome questions both from the Zoom audience and from the live audience. But I think it'd probably be easiest for us to warm up with the questions a little bit if we start right here in the room. And then I'll see if there are Zoom creatures who want to speak. Comments or questions? Yes, right here.
I worked in
And feel
Washington.
free to take your mask down for a question.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I worked in Washington in the late 70s for the Urban Coalition and the Center for Community Change. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about private policies, because the redlining that went on in the real estate industry, where there were whole portions of cities that were deemed bad investments, hurt cities terribly in that period. And there was a big push to get the banks and the real estate industry to be more responsible.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, is one of the things that I'm trying to do with this book. Richard Rothstein, who wrote a really useful book that I teach all the time, The Color of Money. It's a good book, but I think that in that book, there is an overemphasis on the role of government and creating segregation. And what I think is important is to really look at the collusion, the relationship, the partnership, because even in the 1930s, when these redlining policies come into existence in the federal government, that was not the introduction of redlining. Redlining and these kind of segregative practices in the real estate industry had been going on for years prior. And it was because the federal government and our government, both federal, state, and local level, continue to do this. When you are creating new policies, they go to the private sector to get the best practices, to adopt the best practices of the private sector in formatting or formulating new policies. Well, in real estate, best practices meant excluding African Americans. It meant marginalizing Black people. And so the best practices of the private industry were then mapped onto new federal policies and then became much more entrenched and much more generalized. So that created the contours for the battles over fair housing for Black people for the entirety of the 20th century. So it did mean taking on the role of the state in that, but it also meant taking on the role of private industry in having formulated these practices in the first place.
Thank you. It's such extraordinary work. So I wanted to ask also about redlining, and I wanted to know the extent to which it figured in the plans for the Fair Housing Act, and if you found in the archive or in your research that by the time you get to 1968 and these, this bill is being crafted and debated, if it is understood to be a remedy to redlining, is redlining part of that conversation? And then the second part of the question is, were the Fair Housing Act to succeed wildly, what was the sort of narrative of the ideal of outcome of this, rather than the story that you told? And could one have known in 1968, if they just paused a beat and thought about it, that the outcomes that you described would happen?
That's a great question. So there are two things. One, with the Fair Housing Act, I mean, it's really a poor piece of legislation, mainly because it has almost no punitive aspect to it. And so the entire burden is on the party being discriminated against to prove that they have been discriminated against. So there you have the intent issue, which any thinking person, institution by the late 1960s understands that you can no longer be intentional, you have to be oblique. And that thwarts almost all efforts to root out discrimination, which is why impact is always more important than evidence of actual racism. And so in addition to that, I mean, the creation of the Fair Housing Act also created the Civil Rights Division in HUD. So HUD Civil Rights Division is created in 1968. George Romney oversees this process. They are given $6 million to set up operations. They spend $5 million on staffing. And so that leaves $1 million for 120 employees to investigate all claims of racial discrimination in the United States of America that has only become illegal in, you know, that year. So on its face, at its inception, there is not a serious effort to deal with the very real problems of racism. And you know, one of the fascinating things I found when writing the book was about Black workers in HUD and their own efforts to deal with racism within the agency itself, which had gone from being a kind of amalgam of different agencies within the federal government, but that included the FHA, which of course had this decades-long history of discriminating against Black people. And so you have this kind of Black federal workers who have their own kind of insurgency within HUD, who are suing George Romney, suing the agency for racial discrimination and the lack of promotion of Black employees, Black women who've been working in home finance or the FHA, which are two distinct agencies for 20 years, training white men who come in, who then surpass them and become their managers. So that's the atmosphere within HUD. And that is the organization that is then tasked with dealing with housing discrimination. The other thing really quick, just about redlining, is that the Fair Housing Act makes it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race in buying, selling, renting, financing. But it's not illegal on the basis of place, right? So zip code, all allusions to, you know, neighborhood, though that's fair game. And, you know, it's part of the reason between those, because it's not a bill to attack redlining. It's not a bill intended to undo the effects of redlining. It's a bill that has no consequence for redlining, means that those basic structures are kept in place, which is why, of course, some 50 years after the passage of fair housing, we have, you know, it's not exactly the same, but for the most part, in the major cities in the United States are maybe slightly better, but on the whole are as segregated as they were prior. Black homeownership is around the same as it was when fair housing legislation was signed in the first place. So, you know, I think that we can say conclusively that there's very little progress has come in light of this. And I know I'm talking long, but the last thing, which I think is important, is that federal agents were willing to stop the wholesale exclusion of Black homeowners, but it was conditional. And the condition was that Black people could still be segregated. So you could be a homeowner in the city. You could be a homeowner with other Black people in a particular neighborhood or location, but you could not go spoil the housing value in a white neighborhood. So these programs that were created were not to widen the metropolitan scope for potential Black buyers. It was to create homeownership opportunities for Black people on a segregated basis. So in that way, it was very much in tune with expanding homeownership, but maintaining the color line.
Right. Why don't I take, first, go ahead, and then we'll follow with you.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions. The first one is where does transportation figure in what you present? Because it seems to me that there is a relationship between mobility and capacity to move and housing. So I just wondered to what extent that figured in your research. And the second question is, so the picture you paint is largely of white, Black sort of contestation. And I wanted to know to what extent, what was the impact on other racial minority groups? How did they figure in this whole politics of home ownership? I wondered if you found anything in the course of your research.
I mean, not really. I look at a very narrow period from really 1967 to 1974. And so there are two things to consider with that. One is that the kind of ethnic makeup of American cities is underway because of the 1965 Immigration Act, but it's still very much in flux during this period that I'm looking at. And secondly, HUD, FHA, refused to keep racial statistics during this period. And so it's the premise is if you can't count, then there's no problem, right? So if you can't actually identify rates of Black homeownership, of homeownership opportunities for women, none of this is being recorded, then you don't have a problem. And so, you know, there are big lawsuits to try to force HUD to have to keep racial statistics. And, you know, there are organizations that are doing this informally, and periodically HUD would authorize studies of this. And when the outcomes would basically show discrimination, then they would refuse to do the surveys any longer, fearing that it would expose them to a potential lawsuit. So it's very difficult during this particular time to look at what is happening to other groups of people. There's some capture of statistics for Puerto Ricans in the Northeast. There's a whole other story to be told about the implementation of these programs on the West Coast with Chicano and Chicana populations who were the kind of low income, the concentration of low income renters or potential homeowners on the West Coast. Your other question about transportation is crucial. Black people, when, you know, both in terms of jobs and new housing that is going up in the suburbs throughout this period, Black people can't access it. And, you know, there's certainly a relationship between the lack of access and intentional efforts to undermine the creation of mass transportation that cuts across metropolitan areas that would essentially open those areas up. And so, you know, there's that part. And then there's also the way in which white families fight very hard to maintain the color line That's racism. That's also about what I kind of refer to in passing, but I think is an important part of this story is the absence of a meaningful social welfare state in this country, which means that we are all each individually responsible for the care of our lives and our families over time. And so it places an enormous burden on homeownership, right? Because the ability for your asset to accrue over time is what, determines the quality of life for yourself and for your family. And for middle-class white people, working-class white people, that meant keeping Black people out of your neighborhood at all costs. So by even the late 1960s, Black people are still getting bombed out of white neighborhoods. There is an incredible amount of physical violence that is directed at African Americans to keep them out of white areas. So there's a combination of the kind of structural immobility, and then there's the physical force that comes with violence and the threat of violence that is part of what is keeping Black people hemmed in.
Alas, we have time for just one last question. Did you have one as well? Okay, may I ask you to offer a question, and then Joan, you can go ahead and ask a question, and then we'll ask you to answer them both.
Thank you so much for your talk and for the book. I've taught it a couple of times now in my grad seminars, and every time it sparks a lot of great discussion. This is actually the first time I've been able to hear you discuss the book in person, so it was definitely a treat. My question really brings together a couple of threads that you mentioned in the talk, and then also Dr. Nelson's question about if these people had taken a step back, would they have seen that this wouldn't have been successful? And also the point you make about World War II era racial liberalism and the early roots of a lot of this in the New Deal era. And so it makes me think about a figure like Robert Weaver. What do we do with him, right? Someone who has this long career in US housing, director of HUD, who's part of this cohort of, Black liberal thinkers, activists, in their mind, right? They saw themselves as activists. How does he fit into your story? Especially when we think about what you mentioned about the federal workers and a lot of the tensions within the federal government around issues of housing.
Do you mind?
No.
Holding that thought and just collecting one more question, then I'll invite you to respond to Bert. Thank you.
So this is a depressing question. I mean, it is, it does. I thought this was a fabulous dissection of this whole story, and you're linking it to the subprime crisis was perfect. But it makes me wonder about what happens with this work that we do, this kind of research, this kind of history, in having some kind of impact on the problem. It's my own sense of despair, I think, sometimes when I look at these situations, which just repeat themselves over and over and over again. We point out that that's the case. What happens then?
So, that's
it.
Okay.
I'm
sorry to end that way.
Sorry, I took a.
No, you did not. We introduced at length.
So let me, there's the unintended consequences question, right? Was this a malicious program, or were these just, problems that erupted within the course of the program? I don't think that the people who mapped this program out intended it that it was their intention for this kind of spectacular failure. At the same time, its spectacular failure was wholly predictable, though. And that has to do with what I've talked about in terms of the particular history of the real estate industry as abjectly racist. And the idea that people who abhor the existence of Black people, period, let alone in white neighborhoods, will play any meaningful role in ending housing discrimination and creating housing opportunity for African Americans is something worse than naive. And the National Association of Realtors, you know, which has, as an aside, but were vociferously opposed to the Fair Housing Act. They called it forced integration. They sent out millions of postcards. Don't let the government tell you who your neighbor can be. Loved the Hud Act. They backed it to the hilt. They championed it all across the country. And so these are some of, you know, all that you need to know about the kind of support for this bill with no federal oversight in any meaningful way, what the outcome would be, even if that wasn't the intention. And that, you know, speaks to what lessons do we derive from that? The need for strong federal oversight, the need for strong enforcement of the laws that currently exist. And there's no appetite for that. And the reason why there's no appetite for that is because in this country, there is an assumption that the private sector will take care of the housing issue, and that it's the public sector's role to leverage its resources, to leverage its power, to allow the private sector to function in that way. And so the problem, of course, is that left to its own devices, the private sector will not build affordable housing because there's no money to be made in affordable housing. So any of the big, you know, metropolitan areas you go to now, the hot housing is the $1 million condos, you know, or it's just the exploding housing market. It's not low-income housing. And, you know, so it doesn't get built. It doesn't, there is no agenda for that. And, you know, we essentially have a laissez-faire housing market in which there are no checks on, you know, cost, and it can be as high as anyone is able, you know, or willing to pay. And housing, like healthcare, is non-negotiable. You have to have it. And so people, you know, people pay ungodly amounts for it. What do we do with this? I mean, I think part of the frustration that many people, I mean, I'm frustrated for other reasons, but if you think that there is a public policy solution to this within the existing forms of governance and economy that we have, then you're going to be very frustrated because there's not. And, you know, I think the whole discussion, the distortion of our national discussion, which has been narrowed to disparities, right? We only talk about the racial wealth gap, that, you know, look what Black people make or have in wealth compared to white people. How many Black homeowners are there compared to white homeowners? And those are important things to talk about because they can be barometers for the degree of racism in our society. But that is not the main problem. The main problem is the grotesque wealth gap that exists, period. The concentration of wealth and resources and, you know, the 1%, the most elite in this country, that creates a grotesque level of social, economic, racial inequality in this country. And unless there is a massive and radical redistribution of wealth and resources, we will continue to see replications of this over and over, as that's the story of the 20th century, right? I mean, this is not like, how do we end poverty? How do we end housing inequality? You know, like, we know the answers to that, but those are very painful answers that don't want to be, that we can't actually attend to. King, you know, talked about the need for a radical reconstruction of American society. to actually be able to get at the root of poverty and inequality. So that we have the capitalism. There is no solution to these within the realm of capitalism. That doesn't mean that we can't do anything. Of course, there are forms and different kinds of remedies that shouldn't be dismissed, that can have an immediate and impactful effect in people's lives in the here and now. But without dealing with capitalism, they are recurring. I'll just say quickly about Weaver and the racial liberals, was that it failed, I mean, Robert Weaver, it's not just that his ideas failed, he facilitated failure. And so in the 1966 and 1967, when he is in HUD, he is creating new civil rights rules and regulations, right, that the FHA must abide by. At the same time, that I write about in the second chapter of the book, he is allowing the insurance industry to essentially create a shadow agency where they are allowed to disseminate loans. They are allowed, they've created a $2 billion pool of mortgage lending money. Insurance companies are very concerned about the health of cities. They're concerned about cities burning down. They actually have holdings in cities. So it's not true that all capital fled the cities and no one cared about the cities. The insurance industry is very concerned about the cities. So they are the pioneers of this homeownership program. They create a $2 billion pool that will allow Black people to take out loans to buy their own homes as long as they're in the city, as long as they're segregated. And the Robert Weaver allows this and allows them to do it on the basis of racism and segregation. So while he's creating one standard of rules that the FHA must abide by, he is allowing the insurance industry, which is getting FHA insured loans, right? The FHA is insuring their loans that they are distributing in cities, allows them to do so on a racist basis, because that was the only way that they would participate. So he's trapped by the logic of that program that capital gets to say, we'll be involved, but it'll be on our terms. And you can either accept it or not. And so he helps to facilitate the kind of uneven approach to the implementation of new civil rights standards, because racial liberals ultimately see the existing frameworks and structures and governing institutions as essentially sound. But the question is, how do we get more Black people to participate in them? So they're not questioning the foundation or the root of the issue. They're only questioning access, and ultimately it's a failure. And it means that they flip really quick. Like, everybody likes to talk about how great George Romney was because he wasn't a raving racist lunatic. But you could see by the early 1970s, he could turn into one fairly quickly when coming to the end of the kind of normal course of conventional governance, when that no longer worked around the objectives he was trying to achieve, he could quickly fall in line with Nixon's agenda and start blaming Black women and doing all the things that other Republicans and Democrats were engaged in. And on that cheery note.